I'm always thinking when I get introductions like that. A couple of decades ago, I brought Ed Broadbent to University of the Fraser Valley, and our then president did this extravagant praise for Ed Broadbent, and he says, "Well, that's something that my mother would say." Yes. So it's thank you very much for what you said. Turning to St. Stephen's, it opens many doors of memory for me. 1973-74, I lived at Le Brie in Switzerland, and two people I was very close friends with was Charles and Sue Walker, who were some of the founders of St. Stephen's. They were there from 1975 to 1978. And then moving a little forward in history, Sue and Erwin Straight taught there in literature at the time. We having problems getting through?
Yeah, I'm just going to switch the view to Joe, could you mute yours? Let's see what happens now if I... Sorry about that, Ron. There you go.
So am I coming through now?
Yes, it was good before too. I heard everything.
Oh, wonderful. So I mentioned Sue and Erwin Straight, who are now in Kingston. Actually, Charles is there too. So we have two old St. Stephen's people going back the years, which I'm sure some of you may know are in Kingston at the present time. And then Jeremy Weeb was there a few years ago. I've been on the national board of the Thomas Merton Society of Canada for 20 years, and we were doing a conference in New Brunswick, and so I'd spoken on Thomas Merton and Milton Acorn, a very important Canadian poet, but Jeremy asked me to come to St. Stephen's at that time, and I was down there also. So a pleasant history that goes back many decades, and I've always enjoyed immensely the times at St. Stephen's, the people I've known from there, and then the opportunity, as was mentioned, to work with people on their MAs, to be second readers, such lovely people, and obviously doing deep probes into their soul, into society, into the important things in life, which are so significant if people deepen on their faith journey. And then with, as Andrew Klager, who's here with us today, was working on his MA, I brought his MA thesis here he gave me many years ago in Gregory of Nyssa. Fine work. And then I remember very fondly him plowing away with his PhD. We would meet often for coffee every few weeks at a coffee shop, which is now closed. Wonderful journey. And Andrew, of course, has gone on the work he's doing in Peace and Justice with you. Magnificent work. Absolutely A++. And the connection with Bethlehem Bible College. I did an event a few months ago with Canadian Friends of Sabille, which I spoke along with Alex Awad, who's formerly president of Bethlehem Bible College, on the issue of Zionism and the Palestinians, and certainly, obviously, the power imbalance that exists in that situation. And then the fortune, obviously, of working with Brad on his PhD on George Grant, one of our most important Canadian political philosophers, religious thinkers, and Brad's PhD on Grant and Simon Weil, an excellent one, which we managed to get the former Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, to write a very nice endorsement for. So just to give you a sense and feel for St. Stephen's, my affection for the place, the many dear people I have journeyed with, pilgrimaged with together. And Peter Fitch, I saw his lectures on church history, again, splendid, outstanding, and his lecture on Martin Luther was just a delight to sit with. So thank you, Peter, for your work on church history as well. So let me just say a few things. My classes are usually 3 hours long, so I won't bore you with 3 hours. I think I've been given 15 minutes, so I'll scamper along at a nice little pace here, and just like a stone skimming the surface of the water, touch down on some of these things. I'd like to start with just the metaphor of often the gowns that are worn in graduation, where some of the early forms of education emerged in classical Greek thought. And when the students were coming forward to graduate, many of their parents, they had studied intensely. Their teachers had challenged them to think more meaningfully about their soul, society, justice, and peace. And so their parents, when they had finished their rounds of study, had asked that a gala event would be put on in which they would be feted and treated well. And so the parents came dressed in their best togas. And then the students start coming across the foyer area for the dinner that was going to be put on. And they were dressed in these flat mortarboard hats, black gowns of working class people. It would be like someone today at a graduation crossing the floor with a construction hat on and a construction overalls. And people would wonder what is going on here. The parents were somewhat miffed because they thought, in fact, the teachers, they had paid a lot of money to educate their students, would dress them up in the finest of garbs and togas with the brightest of colors. And they asked the instructor, why have you dressed our students, our children, this way? Well, he said, the mortarboard hat is the sign of the working person who mixes cement, who slowly and patiently builds a solid city for the soul and for people and friends. And he says that is the task of an educated person, to serve, to build, and to be kind for others. And the black robe was the working class person's robe that people who had money would never dare to wear in any situation. A plain robe, no color, no stitchery, no ornamentation. And the teacher said, the people I have educated are meant to go back into the city and serve one and all, quietly, often concealed in terms of who they are, but to be servants to all classes, all people, and to be there over a long period of time to serve. The black garment, black is obviously the color of darkness, the night, of difficulty, clouds of unknowing. And so to enter the tragic, the suffering, the painful elements of the human journey, where there often isn't easy answers, but to remain faithful to people's souls and hearts in the very difficult pilgrimages that they go through. And so the black was always to remind them, don't be shallow about light, but also in the midst of suffering, don't slip into cynicism or skepticism. You, in that sense, will become impotent and paralyzed as a human being. So be aware of a naive optimism and a paralyzing cynicism, but know how to hold together hope and tragedy in a very difficult tension to live with. And so the graduating robes then were meant to remind aspiring students who they were meant to be and who they were not meant to be. And so that was to stay with them in every graduation. Then when you see people across the floor, now some obviously the robes following from the Renaissance forward have become prettied up and peacockish in some ways, and it gets away from actually that early earthy understanding of what meaningful education was, from educare, Latin, to draw out what the most meaningful, the most authentic way is to live, and hence the robes, the education, and never to be forgotten when we have temptations, as we can at times, to forget these important, deeper wisdom lessons in that sense. I'd like to read, some of you may know this short story. It's called Acorns, but it might fit in nicely with the kenosis story that has been rightly so reflected upon in its varied ways. Once upon a time, in a not so far away land, there was a kingdom of acorns, nestled at the foot of a grand old oak tree. Since the citizens of this kingdom were modern, fully westernized acorns, they went about their business with purposeful energy. And since they were midlife baby boomer acorns, they engaged in a lot of self-help courses. There were seminars called Getting All You Can Out of Your Shell. There were woundedness and recovery groups for acorns who'd been bruised in their original fall from the tree. There were spas for oiling and polishing those shells, and various organopathic therapies to enhance longevity and well-being. One day in the midst of this kingdom, there suddenly appeared a naughty little stranger, apparently dropped out of the blue by a passing bird. He was hapless and dirty, making an immediate negative impression on his fellow acorns. And crouched beneath the oak tree, he stammered out a wild tale. Pointing upward at the tree, he said, We are that. Delusional thinking, obviously, the other acorns concluded. But one of them continued to engage him in conversation. So tell us, how would we become that tree? Well, he said, pointing downward, it is something to do with going into the ground and cracking open the shell. Insane, they responded. Totally morbid. Why we wouldn't be acorns anymore? As long as your old shell remains in place, you'll never become who you're intended to be, an oak tree. So a lovely little parable of the acorn. I'm reminded of, for those of you who enjoy football, Winnipeg Blue Bombers have won the Grey Cup a couple of years, and their coach was once asked, what's part of the reason, partially, of your success? He says, I always think of the person first and the player second. And I think as educators, we should always think of the person first and the student second, because as a part of a person's soul and life, there's far more than just someone who studies and reads books and writes papers. There's often depths, there's often doors closed in the house of their soul, shutters closed, aspirations to be more than they are. And so as teachers concerned with wisdom and insight, and higher than that, love itself, I think it's a real concern, and I've taught over 35 years, and of course one of my inspirations was George Grant himself, who believed that education was about wisdom, and it was about the highest was love itself, rather than just information and knowledge. And so in this sense, I think what you're doing also at St. Stephen's is trying to inspire, instill a much richer, fuller, wiser view of why we do study and what its purpose is. We probably have women and men in our journeys who we admire as icons of sorts. One of my favorites over the years has been Erasmus, and one of my favorite books he wrote, 1503, he wrote it in 1501, it was published 1503, is the Enchiridion. I read it quite often. I just want to read a couple of quotes from it for you, and I've always linger with them, I sit with them, I allow them to massage my soul and mind and imagination as I journey life's trail. But a couple of them in which he talks about the fact it was somewhat hard and roughish signifies the hidden meaning. He's talking about the Bible and the danger sometimes of interpreting it purely in a literal, grammatical, historic way, whereas hidden, often the analogy is used like an acorn and the kernel, the hard shell of the literal, you crack it and you get to the kernel of wisdom and insight. Or the rind of an orange, you have to peel it to get to the sweetness, actually the orange itself. And too much time is spent sometimes in biblical study on overdoing the literal, the historical, the grammatical, the linguistic. And Erasmus was someone who was deeply rooted in classical patristic exegesis of the East and the West, the Ammas and the Abbas of both traditions. And the time-tried way of reading the Bible is always, what does its inner meaning mean for us in terms of formation, theosis, deification, transformation in the life of community and the life in the world itself? And so a significant part of the Enchiridion is helping people to get a sense, almost midwifing them on how to read the text in a way that opens the soul up as it opens the text up. And in that sense, we don't read the text reads us. And so what Erasmus is doing as a part of this is saying, okay, the text is very important, yes, but how do we read the text? That's far more important, because if people don't know how to appropriately read it at various levels, which speak to various levels of the soul, they'll end up using it in a destructive way, in a hurtful way. And of course, many people have been damaged seriously by a certain approach to reading the Bible and the impact on their church's society itself. So in the Enchiridion, Erasmus unpacks this. In page 96 of this fine little work, he says, "It is better to know less and love more than to know a great deal and love not at all." And so sometimes education can be much more about knowledge than love itself. And often life is thick with conflicts, misunderstandings, culture wars, people polarizing, canceling one another out. And for Erasmus, the danger of a certain type of knowledge, it can polarize, it can fragment, it can separate people, there can be misunderstandings. And for the whole Erasmian tradition of education, and he put together some fine works on what education. In fact, much of our modern understanding of the humanities as education is deeply indebted to Erasmus himself, who John Colet asked to put together for St. Paul's and the Church of England a whole new curriculum for humanities as formation in terms of the soul and society as well. And then one more quote I'll read. He's talking about, and actually Shakespeare will speak to this as much as T.S. Eliot and Bertolt Brecht and people like that. But he says, Erasmus says, this is 16th century. Morality is in a bad way when we have given vices the names of virtues and become more clever at excusing our sins than diligent in amending them, especially if we've learned how to feed and nourish our depraved notions with specious apologetics drawn from Holy Scripture. And so often these texts can be used in ways that actually do the very opposite, which would be similar to a couple of quotes here I thought are helpful. T.S. Eliot's great work, Murder in the Cathedral, that comes after a couple of his very significant works, but Four Quartets is one of his most mature ones. But in Murder in the Cathedral, he says, Beckett says, terrible is the temptation to do good. And sin grows with doing good, for those who serve the greater cause may often make the cause serve them. And so this is formation and spiritual directing is so important in terms of understanding the layered nature of affections and motives, and often how weed and flower will grow closely together. And if people aren't aware often of how that works, great damage can be done, not only in reading the text of their soul, but literal text or the text of the world itself. So it involves almost a surgical knife taken to the flesh of the soul to understand these things. This is why education historically has always been about formation, not information. And some of the finest spiritual directors have emerged from this classical approach to humanities. And so I'd like to turn to an author, he was very popular in the late 1950s, 60s, 70s, probably the most important European novelist who had an impact on the counterculture is Hermann Hesse. Some of you may have read him growing up. He was a phenomenon when as the counterculture, as a season phased away, he sort of disappeared. But there's been quite a revival of Hermann Hesse's writing. I did a book on him. It came out a couple of years ago called Hermann Hesse, Phoenix Arising. Out of the ashes of dying to a certain read of him, a new read, the truer Hesses, and emerged. But at the heart of Hermann Hesse's writings, from Siddhartha to Journey to the East to his great epic, The Glass Bead Game, is the notion of the one who leads as the one should be the greatest servant of all. And his journey to the East, it's not to a literal East in the German in that sense, is where the sun rises, where light begins to emerge for the day of the soul and new life and church and public responsibility in itself. And in the journey to the East, they were called the League. These were spiritual searchers, very intense in an eclectic way on exploring different ways of, in a post-Christendom, post-Christian world, of a deeper spirituality. Very committed, very intense. And one of the people who constantly was with them, he would feed them breakfast, lunches, dinners. He was the servant. People ignored him generally, and each day they would get up and read these great works of spirituality, comparative religion, comparative spirituality, and they stayed together. But one day Leo disappeared, and at times, throughout a period of time, the League vanished, it dissipated, it turned on itself. And the narrator of the book, because it was such an intense period in his life, he sought to understand, why did this fall apart? And part of the journey to the East, or the journey to where light arises, is slowly discover this intense spiritual quest, if in fact not balanced by often those who are ignored, those who often we don't even see for who they are the very ones that hold everything together. And the narrator only discovers at the end of Journey to the East that in fact Leo is the head of the whole order. it's a fascinating turn on who are those we should see, who see, and those we think see often see not. And you get this paradox often, and follow-up great work, the Glass-Bead game, which partially gave Hess the Nobel Prize in 1946, was against the head of the order, and this time the Castalians was Magister Ludi or Joseph Knecht. In German, Knecht means servant once again. And so we come back to what I mentioned earlier in terms of education, the mortarboard hat, the black robe, the servant, and of course this brings us to Jesus, doesn't it, at the end? The one who conceals, in fact, who he is most of the time and quietly serves, often misunderstood, treated indifferently, opposed, but nonetheless serving on the margins, serving at the center, speaking strongly and firmly at times, speaking kindly and softly at other times, modulating who he was to his audience, always accommodating yet always a challenging at the same time. So he in that sense becomes the alpha and omega of what an educator truly is. But there's all sorts of these hints and pointers that reflect on that deeper understanding of what education is. And I think in many ways what you're doing at St. Stephen's and some of these brief reflections on abstracts, they all reflect very, very much some of these few little things I've been saying, which are just mild little pointers, of which all of you are much further along on the trail than I am in this. So I was going to say adieu, but in French that means I'll never see you again. So au revoir would be a better way to do it, in which I shall see you again, hopefully. And thank you for the honor you've given me.